The topic of this video is simplifying imaginary numbers. Most of algebra exists within the real number system. However, as we encounter new types of equations, we need to look outside the set of real numbers to find solutions. For example, the equation x squared equals 1 has two solutions, 1 and -1. But what about the equation x squared equals -1? There is no real number x for which x squared equals -1. For this reason, mathematicians defined a new number, I, such that I squared equals -1. The number I is called an imaginary number and is used to represent the square root of -1. Furthermore, the square root of any negative number is an imaginary number that can be expressed in terms of I. Here are three tools that will help us to work with I. The imaginary number I equals the square root of -1. I squared equals -1. If b is a positive real number, then the square root of -b equals I times the square root of b. This last property will be used the most in this particular section. Let's look at an example. Write each expression in terms of I. We're starting with this, the square root of -25. Prior to learning about imaginary numbers, we would have said that the square root of -25 is not possible, or perhaps more accurately stated, it's not a real number. But now that we have the property that the square root of -b is the same thing as I times the square root of +b, we can simplify the square root of -25 as follows. First, use the property. The negative underneath the radical turns into an I outside of the radical. So we have the square root of -25 equals I times the square root of +25. Of course, the square root of +25 is 5. So this is really saying I times 5, or simply 5I. Our next part, the square root of -12. Well, the square root of -12 is the same thing as I times the square root of +12. Now, the square root of 12 can be simplified. We know that 12 is 2 times 2 times 3. And since there's a pair of 2's, they send one representative out to multiply, leaving the 3 behind. So the square root of 12 becomes a 2 on the outside and a square root of 3 on the inside. Of course, we still have the I. So this gives us our final answer, and it can be written in one of two ways. 2I times the square root of 3, or it could also be written 2 times the square root of 3I. But be careful if you choose this second way of writing it, that you make the length of your radical sufficiently short so that the I is very clearly outside of the radical and not underneath. All right, next problem. The square root of -13. The square root of -13 equals I times the square root of +13. Or another way to write that would be the square root of 13, I. One last example. Write in terms of I, simplify as much as possible. Notice that we have a minus outside as well as inside for this problem. So when we use the property, we're going to focus only on this part of the problem, ignoring the outside minus. This part of the problem right here can be rewritten as I times the square root of +9. And since there was a minus in front of the red box, we will also put a minus in front of this red box. Now, the square root of 9 is 3. So there are three pieces of our final answer, the negative, the I, and the 3. Putting these all together, we get our final answer, -3I.